Hi, this is Michael Cullen for Film Sound Tutorials, and in this video we're going to talk about creating and organizing your tracks for your editorial session. So in the previous video we set up all of our settings for our Pro Tools session, and now we're actually going to create the tracks for it. And so normally when you're talking about sound design for film, we generally categorize all of the sounds in 5 different families. And so that's dialogue, sound effects or hard effects, foley, backgrounds, and music. And so when we create our tracks, we're going to organize our tracks with these 5 families in mind. And so first let's create the tracks for the dialogue. So if we go track, new track, let's make 8 mono audio tracks. Awesome. So here I have 8 new mono tracks, and I'm going to name them corresponding to what audio clips I'm eventually going to put within them. And so if I double click on audio 1, I'm going to rename it to DX1. And if I hit next, I can rename the next track. So DX2, DX3, DX4. And on these tracks, that's where I'm going to put most of my dialogue. Now the next track, I'm going to call it PFX5 and PFX6. And in these 2 tracks, I'm going to put all of my production sound effects that we recorded on set. And so that'll make a little more sense when I talk about it in my dialogue editing video. So the next track, we'll call it the X track, X number 7. And this track is kind of like a storage track where we put audio that we might be using in the final mix. And in the final track, I'm going to call it a FUTS track and put the number 8 on it. And a FUTS track is an audio track where you put dialogue lines that needs to be futzed in some manner. And so that could be dialogue that needs to go over a phone or maybe going through perhaps a wall. Great, so here I have my 8 dialogue tracks, and I'm going to color them just so it's easier to tell which ones are part of the family. I like to do light blue. And there we go. So after making the dialogue tracks, I'm going to add my sound effects tracks. And my sound effects tracks are where I'm going to put all my sound effects, or what I call hard effects. And these are normally effects that I will find in my library. And we'll talk more about that when we do my sound effects tutorial. So Control-Shift-N for new track. And for sound effects, I normally create 4 mono audio tracks. And then I'm going to create 4 stereo audio tracks. Great. I'm going to call this FX1. And for sound effect tracks, you normally add the type of track that it is. So this is a mono track. And I'm going to copy this so I can rename the next track really easily. So we'll call this FX2 mon, FX3 mon, FX4 mon. And then the next following 4 tracks are my stereo tracks. So we'll call them FX5 ST for stereo. Copy that. FX6 stereo, FX7 stereo, and FX8 stereo. So for the effects tracks, I like to color them yellow, but it doesn't really matter. Awesome. Now, underneath my effects tracks, I'm going to add my Foley tracks. And so Foley effects are a special type of sound effects that are normally made by the characters within a scene. And they are special because they are normally recorded specifically for each film. And so a great example of Foley sound effects are footsteps and a cloth pass. And Foley tracks will come in a variety of organization structures, but for simplicity's sake, let's make 6 mono audio tracks, and we'll make 2 stereo audio tracks for Foley. And so there they are. And same thing, I'm going to name them 1 mon, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 is a stereo track, and so is 8. And for the Foley, I like to make them orange. So there you go. Now, after the Foley tracks, we're going to add my background tracks. And since most of my background tracks are created in mono and stereo, let's make 2 mono tracks and then 6 stereo tracks. Great, so here they are. Now, for backgrounds, the way that you organize the tracks are a little more important because we're going to break up our backgrounds into 2 pairs of 4 tracks. So within those pairs, I'm going to have 1 mono track and then 3 stereo tracks. And so when we made the new tracks, I have my 2 mono tracks on top. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this audio track to be underneath 3 stereo tracks. And so you can kind of see now I have 1 mono track, 3 stereo tracks, and you can tell by the line going through the track. And then another mono track, and then 3 stereo tracks. And so like I said, these are 2 pairs of 4, and so I'm going to name them accordingly. So our first pair of 4 is going to be called BGA1, and then we'll put mono on it to remind ourselves that it's a mono track. We'll call this BGA2 stereo, and then I'll copy that so I can easily rename the next one BGA3 stereo, BGA4 stereo, and then now we're moving on to our second pair, so we'll call this BGB1 mono, and then BGB2 stereo, BGB3 stereo, and BGB4 stereo. Great. So by naming it in that fashion, now we can tell that there's 2 different pairs. And so for my background tracks, I like to color them green. So I'll just select them all and turn them green. So after our background tracks, we're going to add our music tracks. And music also comes in a variety of formats. So I might have to change the organization of these music tracks later. But for now, let's add 8 stereo audio tracks. And here they are. And we're also going to split this up into 2 pairs of 4. So we'll call this MXA1. And since they're all stereo, I don't have to append that to the end. MXA2, MXA3, MXA4. And then we'll start our second pair, which will be MXB1, MXB2, MXB3, and MXB4. And I like to make them purple. Awesome. So now we have tracks for all of our different families. And if you notice, whenever I created these tracks, I normally organize them in groups of 8. And that's just because when you get to the mixing process and you're actually using the tracks on a mixing board, all of the faders on a typical mixing board are grouped in sets of 8. And so by organizing your tracks in groups of 8, then your session looks really clean on the mixing surface. So one last thing that I'm going to do before I import any audio, and that's to create my 2-pop. And so a 2-pop is a 1-frame audio clip that we use to sync up the visuals with the sound. And the reason it's called a 2-pop is because it plays 2 seconds before the start of the film. And so in our case, the 2-pop should play at 59:58. So I'm going to zoom in to 59:58 by hitting R and T, and here's the frame of 59:58. And so the standard for a 2-pop is a 1K tone at -20 dB. And so to create that tone, we can go to Audio Suite, Other, and then open up the plugin called Signal Generator. And so here's Signal Generator, and the default setting for Signal Generator is our 2-pop standard. And so now that we have Signal Generator open, we need to create a blank clip to be able to render the signal into the clip. And so the shortcut to create a blank clip in Pro Tools is Shift-Alt-3. So here's our blank 1-frame length clip. So I'm going to render this signal into the blank clip by hitting Render. So there's my new signal. So now that I have my signal in this clip, I'm going to rename it 2-pop. so everyone knows what it is. And then I'm going to duplicate this clip onto every track within my session. So to do that, I'm going to click on the clip and then hold Windows Alt, which duplicates and then elevators the new clip onto the track of your choosing. And so I'm going to hit Windows Alt a couple different times, and you can see that I'm duplicating the 2-pop onto all of my tracks. And so the reason we're adding a 2-pop to every track is that it helps us see if any track becomes unsynced during the editing process. So now I have 2-pops within all of my dialogue tracks, and for sake of not blowing out our speakers, let's mute all of the 2-pops except the first one. So to select all of them, I'm going to hit Shift and then P, which just traverses up in your edit window. And then I'm going to right-click and hit Mute Clips. Awesome, and so now you can see the selected clips are muted. So now we have 2-pops on all of our dialogue tracks. Let's do the same thing for our mono tracks. And instead of copying all of them, what I can do is Shift P, and then I can copy these 2-pops into the next 4 mono tracks. And I'm going to unmute the first one, because now we're in a new family. And then now I'm going to add 2-pops into my stereo tracks. And so what I can do is I can select 2 of the mono 2-pops, and if I Windows Alt to elevator and duplicate the clips, I can make a stereo file by using the 2 mono files. And so I'm just going to duplicate them all the way through. Great, so now let's do the same thing for the Foley tracks. And so first we need a couple mono 2-pops, which I'll put there. And then we need 2 stereo 2-pops. And let's unmute the first one of the family. So moving on, now we need 1 mono 2-pop and a few stereo 2-pops. And since I need the same combination for the next 4, I'm just going to do Shift P, copy the 4 of them, go down by hitting apostrophe, and then by using that, I can select the next 4 tracks on my session and paste them within. And then let me unmute the first one of the family. And so for the music family, I need 8 stereo 2-pops. And so I can just copy these down. And I could have probably done it faster, but for sake of simplicity, here you go. And I'm going to unmute the top one. Great, so now we have all of my new tracks and a 2-pop. Let's save our session by going File, Save. And now we're set to import my picture lock and all the audio clips that were sent from the editor. So this concludes this tutorial of creating our tracks and then making 2-pops for the tracks. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next video. All right, take care.